All right, all right. In the words of Matthew McConaughey, I don't think I quite say it like he does, but welcome back from lunch. Hope you all enjoyed it. Um, I scarfed down something real quick, got a good floss and brush in, and I'm ready to go for our last couple of presentations. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being interactive throughout the chat and the Q&As. I've learned a lot today just from the presentations, as I hope that you all have as well. And I'm excited to see what our last couple of presentations had to offer. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Again, we want to encourage all of you to join the grant, so the Georgia Research Administrators Network group on LinkedIn, and Gail Spat has put that link directly to the group in the chat a couple of times, and I'm sure she'll do it again. Thanks, Gail. Also, you'll all registered participants will receive an email with an evaluation. You will be able to evaluate the overall conference as well as the individual sessions all in one evaluation. It'll simply allow you to check each session that you were able to attend. And if you weren't able to attend them all, then you won't be asked questions about it. Also, a copy of all presentations and handouts, if there were any, will also be emailed to those registered participants. I have been putting in the individual presentations in PDF format in the chat, and so I will do the same with this next presentation. But I'd like to turn it over now to Josh Rosenberg, who is the Senior Director of Grants and Contracts Accounting at Georgia Tech. I remember Josh from my time at Emory. Josh, we're excited to hear what you have for us today, talking about best practices for monitoring research expenditures. So I'm going to turn it on over to you, and I'll jump back in when we're ready for Q&A.
All right, thanks, Erica, and good afternoon, everybody. I can't believe that Matthew McConaughey reference was the lead-in for my presentation. I am not even half as cool as Matthew McConaughey, but I'll give it a shot. And also, I got the post-lunch session, so I think my job is to effectively keep you awake until I can turn it over to my friend Rashonda Harris to give her presentation. So in looking at the chat prior to presenting, when I can't even see the chat now, but prior to presenting, it was great to see so many familiar names of folks from my past. I've been at Georgia Tech since September 1st, and prior to that, I spent 9 years at Emory in various cost accounting and post-award capacities, both in central administration and in the Emory School of Medicine. So that was 9 years. And prior to that, I spent 2 years as a GSU Panther at Georgia State in post-award administration. And prior to that, 4 years at Northwestern. If we have any folks from Chicago, I spent 4 years in Northwestern, and that was actually the start of my career in research administration. And actually, my first job was as a senior financial analyst doing cost accounting. And I remember I remember reading A21 for folks who've been around a while, A21 circulars. I read that to try and prepare for my interview. And I've never read so much content that made absolutely no sense whatsoever as to when I was reading that and preparing for those interviews. I think I fell asleep a good 3 times during one reading of that. And so that was my start in all of this. What I want to talk to you guys about today is research expenditures, best practices for monitoring research expenditures. And a lot of this is very much, for those of you who are in post-award or have been in the cost accounting space, you're very familiar with this, and probably most of you are familiar with these concepts in general. But definitely these are things that we've seen throughout our career in research administration, and just various tips and thoughts that I have over the course of my career for sort of best practices for how to manage this very important task that we have in research administration of watching what we spend and reporting on it. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about training, types of expenditures, roles and responsibilities. Very important that folks understand what their roles are in the organization, what their responsibilities are, and who in each organization is supposed to handle what. And that's not always a very clear-cut area, as we know. Systems and internal reports, I have lots of experience with systems, and so I always love to talk about that. Touch on unique sponsor requirements, the importance of policies and procedures at your institution, and also the role of our friends, the auditors. Okay, so I always want to start with training because I think this is the most important thing that we can do in our roles and in research administration to help our community best be prepared for what the compliance requirements are and all of the nuances of this research administration world. 2 CFR 200, it's very funny, at Emory, when I was there, we always called it uniform guidance, and that was literally the term we used. And then I come to Georgia Tech and everyone calls it 2 CFR 200. It's like uniform guidance doesn't even exist, but 2 CFR 200 is. So it's of course pretty dry material unless you're living in our world, and then it's kind of exciting. But we always educate folks about what's in 2 CFR 200, why it's important, what we need to follow, what we need to pay attention to. And, you know, trying to educate folks on material like this is hard. We know it's hard for new folks coming into this field. All of this stuff doesn't resonate like it does for us when we've been in this for such a long time. So I always want to talk about 2 CFR 200, the big four. Okay, the big four. That was something I learned about very early on, and probably many of you did as well. And the importance of those 4 words and what they mean. Cost transfers, when we think about cost transfers, you know, I always take it from an auditor perspective. Why is someone moving money from one place to another? Why wasn't it charged correctly in the first place? What are the justifications for having these cost transfers? How can we defend it? Cost sharing. I've talked about this when I was at Emory for years as to how much I don't like cost sharing. Okay, not only is it very costly for the institution, but the administrative requirements are a challenge with cost sharing. And it's something everywhere I've been, it's something that folks love to do. And so in training about it and teaching people about it, I always talk about the financial impact of cost sharing. Not just about the impact on the F&A rate calculation, but the idea that it's a dollar that's benefiting research that we're not charging the sponsor for, that the university is paying the freight for. And when we charge salary dollars, we not only don't recover those salary dollars, we don't recover fringe, and we don't recover F&A on top of that. So the education about the impact of cost sharing is important. Things like effort reporting and salary caps, really, really critical. You know, we spend a lot of time, my 7 months here at Georgia Tech, already I've spent a lot of my time focused on effort reporting and salary caps and making sure that folks understand the importance of staying within the salary cap, how to track that, how to measure that, how to show over the cap cost sharing. Service centers is an area, and really F&A too. Those are areas that are certainly things that the cost accounting folks understand really well. And when I explain service centers to people, I always describe them as little businesses that exist at your institution for the purpose of providing goods or services to other internal operations within your institution. And to do that, you have to have rates that you've calculated and can defend as being at cost rates. With F&A is where I got my career started. And folks always hear about overhead and indirect costs and F&A and say, what in the world is that? And a lot of people around campus think about it as a source of revenue. But it's really not a source of revenue. It's a source of cost recovery. And for most all of us, it is not full cost recovery. Okay, so the education of helping the PIs and folks in the department and central admin understand what F&A rates are really designed to do and why they aren't just revenues to the institution, regardless of what some folks may say. From a compliance standpoint, the importance of subcontract, subrecipient monitoring. Different institutions have this responsibility in different places. Some folks have it in their post-award shops. Others have it in their pre-award offices. And so just understanding the importance of making sure that when you give somebody money designed for a specific purpose, that you're keeping track of how they're spending it. You're making sure that they're billing you in a timely manner so that those expenses can hit the grant. So importance of that. The award setup and invoicing processes, that's something that I've become intimately familiar with in my role here at Georgia Tech. And in particular, when you have new systems, as we do, new financial systems, these tasks are not only, they're important everywhere, but the challenge of doing them in a new system is something that is really important to help folks understand how to do and to train them on. And so we talk about all the different steps that go into setting up an award and all the steps that go into putting an invoice together and sending it to the sponsor, making sure that our colleagues in the departments and our PIs understand that we can't bill for something unless the expense has already hit. And so it's important that those expenditures be on those grants in a timely manner. Reporting, educating on all the different types of reports that we're responsible for sending to the sponsor. Really important to do that. Managing budgets. It's important in your personal life. It's important in with grants as well. So really making sure that folks are aware of what their budgets are on their awards. Overspending is something that's always a key focal point, because you can't charge the sponsor beyond the award amount, and someone's going to have to pay the bill since the sponsor isn't going to pay it. So making sure people are keeping track of what their budget is, what their spending rate is, how much they have left, what their encumbrances are, and so on. The award closeout process, that's always, I think, one of the toughest areas in post-award research administration, because it's hard enough to keep up with all the awards that we establish, hard enough to keep up with all the invoicing and financial reports, but closing out those awards in a timely manner, making sure everything's clean before you shut down the award, that's something that's a critical process that folks need to understand. And so, like I said, I always like to start with training, because the more you can educate people around campus, your own offices, your constituents and colleagues around campus, the better shape you're going to be in from a compliance perspective, from an audit perspective, from just about every perspective. And I think it's important to remember, for those of us who've been in this field a long time, or even just a couple of years, this is not something that most people learn in school. They don't get it in undergrad. They don't get it in graduate school. So for most of us who get into research admin, we are learning this from scratch. And we can't forget what it's like to learn that, what it was like for us to learn this from the beginning. And so when you're training people, you're educating them, you have to teach it to them from a foundational level. Don't just assume that they're going to understand and this stuff is going to make sense, because to none of us, it probably made much sense when we first learned it. Okay, I think probably everybody on the call, or most everybody on the call, is familiar with the types of expenditures at a basic level. The way I always think about this is, if something is benefiting a research award in terms of a cost, if a cost is benefiting a research award, it's going to be in one of these two categories. It's either going to be something that we can directly charge, or something that is part of our F&A or overhead recovery rate calculation. And all of us, I would venture to say that all of us are in this bucket. Okay, we're research administrators. We are all here. Most of us are probably going to land in the indirect cost section, but it's important, I think, for folks around campus and in your institutions to understand that if anything, if any cost, if any time spent is benefiting research, it's in one of these two buckets. And we need to recover for these costs that we spend in order to benefit research. And if we're not recovering for them, then it could be cost sharing, could be waived F&A, or we simply aren't billing in a timely manner, and our time to bill has run out. But it really is just, I think, really important for everybody to understand that we are all in this, okay? And just because you may not be direct charged to an award does not mean that the work you're doing does not benefit that award, okay? Indirect costs, overhead, F&A, it's always an education for our faculty members, our administrators around campus to understand that these are very real costs, and they are very necessary costs in order to execute on our mission and on the tasks that we're given with any research grant. So I think it's one of those things when you are at your institution and you have the opportunity to explain to folks what indirect costs are and why they're so important. Make sure that you present the argument that these are very real and they're very necessary, and research cannot take place without the costs that are included in this indirect cost column here. All right, roles and responsibilities. This really does differ by the different types of organizations, but I think it's fair to say that across the board, post-award, in particular research administration, is a responsibility that's shared amongst different areas within the organization. Central administration, obviously I'm in central administration, many of you are. It's probably many of you are departmental administrators as well. Of course, our principal investigators, they're the ones whose name is on the award, along with your institution. So they bear a tremendous responsibility for not only the execution of the aims of that research, but also the fiscal and operational oversight of the awards that they get. So this is something that I think is, especially with the first two, is something that I think is a challenge. And for most institutions is, where is the line drawn between what central administration does and what departmental administrators are responsible for doing? And many of you, my old colleagues at Emory and some other places as well, may have implemented shared services models. Emory did now 8 years ago. And so the shared services model, where research administration service centers exist out there in the schools. They are basically central administration type offices that live in the schools, and they serve various specific departments across the university. And as we were rolling out those research administration service units 8 years ago, starting 8 years ago at Emory, roles and responsibilities was a really critical thing to iron out, and it took a long time to iron it out, okay, as to who's going to do what, where are the invoices going to lie, where are the financial reporting responsibilities going to lie, how much of the proposal preparation is going to take place in those research administration service units versus how much is going to land in your Office of Sponsored Programs, or OSP at many places. So it's really critical that everybody on campus who has anything to do with research administration understands where they are in terms of the organization and what their roles and in particular responsibilities are. Okay, it seems like it's something that's so basic and something that should just be in a RACI document and should be not a big deal to flesh out. But a best practice, honestly, across campus is making sure that everybody knows who does what. And I always tell people, org charts are like my mini Bibles. I love organizational charts. I have to know who everybody is, who they report to, and what those offices are responsible for. I still haven't totally figured it out at Georgia Tech in my 7+ months there. It took me a long time at Emory to figure out what everybody does and who's responsible for what. But it really is important across the board for everybody, including PIs, to understand where the responsibilities lie in any organization. Okay, systems and internal reports. So across my career, I have been a part of 4 different systems implementations, financial systems implementations. And that doesn't mean that I was always there when it first started. or as it was going live. But when I say for, I mean I was either there when it was going live, or it was being planned, or I got there shortly after the new financial system was rolled out. And as many of you know, having gone through it, it is quite a task to manage in a new system world. I think it often takes several years for people to get comfortable with those new systems, to know where to go to get things, to be able to get the sort of reports that you need to do your business. I remember back in when I joined Emory, it was shortly after going live with PeopleSoft. And one of the things that was one of the biggest challenges for everybody across campus was trusting the data. Okay, data integrity. It doesn't matter what your reports look like if you don't trust the data. And building that trust and the development of a data warehouse to get your reports from, that takes a long time, in my opinion. But you got to have that trust in the data, and you got to be patient, because it takes a really, really long time to get to the point where you feel totally confident. At Georgia Tech, we went over to Workday in July of 2019. Obviously, that was before I joined Georgia Tech, but I think it's fair to say that we are still adapting to the system and still trying to learn what the system can do for us, how to do certain things, what reports we can use, how to deal with all the different reports that we have, and which ones do we really need, and which ones can maybe we streamline or cut out at this point. So that's a process. But when it comes to the sort of reports that you want to look at, of course, it's going to depend on what level you're in the organization. If you're at an executive level, if you are the VP of Finance or the president or the VP of Research, then the types of information you're looking for is not really the same stuff that many of us are looking for in our day-to-day operations. They're looking at a very high level. They want to see what's the trend in proposals, raw counts and dollar amounts. What's the trend in awards? Same thing. Expenditures, okay, direct and indirect. How are they doing overall? How is each individual school or college doing in terms of expenditures? Year-over-year trends. Understanding whether we're going up, we're flatlining, we're going down. I'm really interested in seeing how these reports are going to look, starting with March data, because of course last March was the unofficial beginning of the pandemic, when everything slowed down. So it'll be really interesting to see what things look like year over year, starting with March data. Focus on direct and indirect cost trends. It is, indirect costs are what funds many of us. Okay, we are in the indirect cost pools. We are, the work we do benefits research tremendously, but it's in the overhead buckets. So it's a funding source for many of us, and executive level folks need to see how we're doing in terms of our F&A recovery year over year. How are things looking? Because it's a huge component of many of our budgets. Central research admin, the level that I operate in, things like reports on invoicing, understanding expenditures that have been incurred that we cannot bill for yet, those that we have incurred that are ready to bill, but we haven't sent out the invoice yet. The different types of invoices we obviously have. For many of you, letter of credit is going to be a big source of invoicing, and a big component of invoicing, and a big source of cash into your institution. So we have obviously a lot of NSF funding, NIH funding. Those are letter of credit, Department of Energy, Department of Ed. And so making sure that we're keeping up with our letter of credit invoicing, that we're doing it on a regular basis, is really important to be able to see and to track that. Our AR, our accounts receivable. If somebody, in my personal life, if somebody owes me $5, I'm at their virtual door within a week. But accounts receivable, we obviously, once we've billed the sponsors, we want to know when we're going to get our money and how long it's going to take to get it. So it's important to know what's out there that we're waiting to be paid on. Financial reporting, the different types of reports we have, quarterly, monthly, annual. From my level, I need to be able to see how we're doing on our reporting. Are we reporting in a timely manner? Are we getting all our reports out in a timely manner? Quarterly reporting is a big deal for many of us, and so we certainly expect April. This month is a big quarterly reporting month for March month end or quarter end. So the volume of the different types of reports we get and how we're doing on that is really critical. From a PI and departmental level, having reports like dashboards that will show those folks the different awards or grants that are in a PI's portfolio, what their budgets are, how much they've spent, how much they have encumbered. Okay, you may not encumber salaries, or maybe you do, but if you have people being paid off those grants, it's good to know that those are expenses that can't be used for other purposes. So folks need to see that. The pending F&A charges that are going to be assessed on those encumbrances are important, because folks need to see how much money am I going to have left to spend, and how long do I have until the end date of the award. So you want to know if spending's occurring, and if so, are we billing for that? Have we been billing our sponsors in a timely manner? Burn rate is really important. You have a 3-year award and you're in the 3rd month and you've already spent 60% of the budget. Well, that's probably going to be a problem. And it's also a problem on the other side. Sometimes it takes a long time to start booking expenditures onto grant. So you may only have 5 months left, but you've only spent 50% of the award funding. And that's problematic, because if you don't spend and you don't record those expenditures, and then the grant ends and several months have passed and you're past the point where you can charge the sponsor, those are costs that are going to have to be covered by your institution. Knowing who's charged to the award, that's really important. You're a PI, you need to know what individuals have salaries that are being charged to your grant. It shouldn't be a case where you look at this and say, I have no idea who that person is. I don't know what they do. What are they doing charged to my award? That could be a problem. It could have been a mistake. So that's something that, all these things are things that need to be tracked regularly, and monthly expenditure reviews are ideal. Now, I know, having been in this field a long time, it is very hard, especially at large institutions, for PIs, for administrators, to be able to make the time to look at this on a frequent basis. But it is really important, just like it is, to check your credit card statement online, your bank statement online. You don't have to check that stuff every day like I do, because I'm kind of insane. But you do need to be on this stuff, because if something gets charged that should not be charged, we want to fix it in a timely manner. Otherwise, it becomes what's called a late cost transfer, as many of you know. And then when you have a late cost transfer, you have to write quite a lengthy explanation for why and how it won't happen again. So we want to do this in a timely manner. Know thy sponsor. So, many folks have a big portfolio of awards from NIH, NSF, Department of Defense, Energy, Department of Education, all different sponsors, foundation sponsors, state agency sponsors, industry. And it's really important to be familiar with the different guidance that is issued by these sponsors. And so, it's a lot to read, right? And so sponsors expect you to follow your own guidelines. First of all, they expect you to follow 2 CFR 200 or uniform guidance. They expect you to follow your own guidelines, and they expect you to follow sponsor guidelines. And oftentimes sponsor guidelines are more restrictive than your own policies. And when that is the case, you got to follow those more restrictive guidelines from the sponsor. So that familiarity with what is and what is not allowed for a given sponsor is really, really important. So when I was at Emory is a DHHS school. So NIH is the dominant federal funding agency for Emory. So we had to be very familiar with that grants policy statement. At Georgia Tech, we are an ONR, or Office of Naval Research School. So we get a lot of funding from Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, NSF as well, and NIH. So we have to be familiar with all of those sponsors and the different requirements that they all have. And it's something that, as you guys know, it takes a long time to get really comfortable with this. And that's why I said at the beginning that when you're training new folks, we have to remember that they've never, in many cases, seen any of this before. So it is learning it all from scratch. And PIs are not going to be expected to know this, but in central administration, we have to. And departmental administrators, to an extent, also have to be familiar with these policies. So it's important to keep up to date with these things. Uniform, or 2 CFR 200, uniform guidance, when they issue revisions or new things that came out like they have recently, somebody at your institution, at least one person, needs to be familiar with what those changes are, and to make sure that they're educating the community on what's out there. We can't assume that everybody is going to be able to read all of the emails that come from all the various places that update us on adjustments to sponsor policies or uniform guidance changes or things like that. So and some of those people may be you, who are at your institution, and you are basically the voice to the institution of changes in policies and things of that nature. So best practice, make sure at least one person on your campus is keeping up to date with these changes. Okay, policies and procedures. This is some dry stuff. Okay, and it is really important to keep your policies and procedures current. And it's something I have 15, I want to say, policies at Georgia Tech that have my name assigned to them. I swear, I started September 1st, and September 2nd, suddenly I had 15 policies. They were fast in that regard. And my task this year is to go through all of those policies and review what changes need to be made, submit them for review by our policy governing body. And one of the things that I'm looking to do not only is to update the policies for our systems changes, but also to make sure that our policies are not heavy on procedures and specific steps to do things, because policies and procedures are different things, okay? And you want to make sure, because auditors will hold you to your policies and procedures. So the more, it's counterintuitive, because we have faculty who everywhere I've been, they want to say, show me in the policy where I can't do this, or that this is allowed or this is not allowed. And policies generally are meant to be broad, because anything you put in there is subject to heavy audit scrutiny. So generally speaking, having a lot of detail in your policies is probably not a good idea. You want to put it in a guidance document, procedural documents, maybe in training sessions to campus. If you're in a post-award or pre-award central office, maybe you can issue bi-weekly or monthly tips and updates and things of that nature that don't become formal documents. So just be careful with those, but it really is important to make sure that they are kept current. You want to educate your campus as to any changes you make in policies and procedures. And you also want to understand the approval process for getting updates to policies and procedures. Who has to approve them? How many different channels does it have to go through? It could sometimes take months, realistically months. So just be prepared for that as you make any changes. All right, working with auditors, depending on some places, internal audit shops don't do a lot with sponsored programs. And often that's because, if you think about internal audit, they report up to the president typically, and they are an internal audit operation for all of your institution. So they have a really big purview to cover. Sponsored programs are, as we all know, are a heavy compliance area. We are all trained from like day one as to the importance of compliance and how regulated this industry is. And so most of us have, I wouldn't say most of us, but we all to some extent have central administration research offices that are, all of us are focused on compliance, and all of us are devoted to compliance and making sure that our institutions are protected and stay safe. And so, you know, it's an area that some internal audit shops may not worry as much about because we in central admin and research admin are already managing it to a large extent. But it is still nonetheless an area within a university that does merit some audit review internally. And so I think it's important, it is a best practice to use internal audit as part of your team. It may not feel that way, but to see them as a partner in the process, because they are designed to protect the same institution that you work for, to protect you and to make sure that you are following regulations and compliance, so that when it comes time to be reviewed externally by sponsors or by your by the entity that does your single audit, by the state if you're a state entity, that you are in as good a shape as you possibly can be in. So I work already in 7+ months. I've spent a lot of time working with our internal audit partners on various areas related to post-award administration. And I use them as a sounding board to get their thoughts on what do you think? We're looking at changing our policy or our procedures in a certain way. What are your thoughts on whether that would work or not? You know, focus on your weak areas. We would all love to say we are perfect in all areas of research administration, but the reality is, you know, we have a lot to do. We all have a lot to do. And there are areas that we all feel a little vulnerable in. And I think those are good areas for you to focus on with your internal audit partners to try and improve on those areas. Institutional areas of concern. It's something, it's a little, I know it's a little counterintuitive where you say, I want to talk to internal audit about things I'm worried about, but that's what they're there for. And if you don't talk about those things with them, the fear is that external auditors are going to come in and they're going to find those things if you haven't already sort of worked through them. So don't be afraid to use internal audit as your colleagues, as your partners in this process of compliance. For external audit, for federal, for your single audit, old A133 uniform guidance 2 CFR 200 audits, for your state auditors, for individual sponsor auditors, you know, internal controls are really important now. For those of you who are not familiar with the COSO internal control integrated framework with the 5 components and 17 principles, that gets applied to companies, and all types of entities are applying that framework to establish an effective system of internal control. And we see it, our external auditors are looking at our internal controls through that lens. So it's a good idea, if you're not familiar with it, to familiarize yourself with the COSO internal control integrated framework. When you think about high risk areas, think anything that involves salary, whether it is a salaries, fringe, cost transfers, effort reporting, those are always really big risk areas. And subrecipient monitoring is another area that's a high risk area. That's what auditors are focusing on, is those areas where that pose the highest risk to the sponsor, to the institutions. So it's a good idea to take a good look at what those risk areas are at your institution, and maybe start thinking about different ways that you can manage those risks and get ahead of the game before the auditors ask you about them. Compliance supplement, which is sort of a guidance document each year that tells auditors what they need to be focusing on when they're doing the single audit. Probably everybody on this call knows about the CARES Act and the funding that came in and how quickly that came in, and how it was being tested by the audit community and how it was being set up. That was certainly an area that that was hard to manage because it was done so quickly last spring. And then we have additional CARES funding as well. So that compliance supplement is always something that auditors need to pay attention to so they know what they should be asking us about. Stay current with uniform guidance. Like I said, that's UG as uniform guidance. Make sure somebody in your institution is keeping up to date with any changes here. And my last thought is always ask yourself, can you defend that expenditure across the table from an auditor, right? They're shining the bright light on your face and they're asking you, are you sure about that expense? Does that seem okay to you? And of course, you'd be nervous in that situation no matter what. But the more nervous you get, obviously, the harder it's going to be for you to defend that that's a legitimate cost that should be charged to that award. So you always, as you monitor research expenditures, as you're in this field, you always want to think like an auditor, always, and say, if I had to defend this, if I had to defend this for my institution, or I had to defend it for my PI or for myself, could I do it? Okay, would I feel comfortable doing that? Does that make sense? We used to say at Emory, how would you feel if that got out and got on the headlines in the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution? Would you be cool with that? Well, that's going to make anyone nervous, but you really want to feel like you would be comfortable with that expenditure. And so when we do cost transfers and we get justifications for cost transfers, I always tell folks, think about it from an auditor perspective. Is that something that you could defend? Is an auditor going to read that and say, okay, I understand why this cost is being transferred? So think like an auditor at all times. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. Again, I couldn't see anything, if anything came in on the chat or not. So we have a couple of minutes. Erica, let me know if anyone has any questions.
Sure. So Josh, we'll do just like we've done the other sessions. If you all have a question that has not already been put into the chat, feel free to raise your hand and I'll go ahead and unmute you. But in the meantime, Josh, one of the questions is it common for department admin costs to come out of F&A?
Department admin costs to come out of F&A. What do you mean by that?
So this question, I'm not sure who it was asked for because I just copied the question. I believe it's like the distribution of F&A though to the department to support the admin probably.
Oh, so we're talking about an F&A recovery and distributions to the various schools and departments, I think. Is it common? Boy, I love this question. So each school has a different mechanism for how they collect F&A, who collects it, and how it's ultimately distributed. It is really important to understand a point I made earlier, which is that F&A is not recovery, is not revenue. It is cost recovery. And none of us, I venture to say, are recovering our full cost of the overhead costs that we incur to support research for various reasons. Negotiating the F&A rate is always going to be a rate that's less than the calculated rate. Certain sponsors like Department of Education, certain foundations don't pay full F&A. Oftentimes they pay a lot less. So the university is never made whole by F&A cost recovery. But again, different places have different models. Some institutions collect it all centrally and then allocate it out as part of an appropriations process to the individual schools. And often it's up to the deans of those schools to then distribute that to the various departments within that school. And then it's up to the department to then distribute it to the various PIs and the various labs at the institution. Other places will return all of the F&A to the individual schools themselves where the awards live. And then of course the schools again make the decision as to how that gets distributed to the departments and then the PIs. But in those sorts of models, if an individual school or college gets its own F&A back, then what often happens is they get assessed a central allocation cost, which is essentially like a bill that that the schools then pay to central administration to cover offices like Central Post Award Administration, the Controller's Office, Human Resources, the President's Office, General Counsel, all of those things, the facilities management across the organization, information technology. So the question was, is this common? I've seen various models across the board, but because F&A cost recovery does not recover full cost, the PIs and the departments are rarely going to feel like they are getting enough F&A back in return for the expenses incurred. That's just the reality of it.
Okay. And we have a question: who establishes the PI dashboard? And I guess what types of softwares are used for those dashboards?
So at Georgia Tech, as I mentioned, we moved over to Workday back in July of 2019. And so over the course of the last year and a half or so, we have created many reports using Workday as our source. So one of them is a PI dashboard. So it can be a report that's created directly from your financial system. Alternatives are, if you have a data warehouse, whether it's an Oracle product or another product, it can be like Tableau. It can be, reports can be created from the data warehouse, which oftentimes is a little easier, assuming that your financial system feeds your data warehouse in a timely manner. And so either of those options, I think, work well. But it's really important, like we have, to have a really good systems team in place that understands the grants world and understands research administration really well. It is, and we had this at Emory too. We had folks who not only understood the IT world, but they also understood the grants world. And it's such a valuable combination for folks to have because they can speak both languages. So several different options that you can do straight out of the financial system or out of a data warehouse.
All right, thanks for that. I have another question. Can you share some best practices for departmental administrators for monitoring subrecipients?
So it really depends, of course, on where that responsibility lies in your organization. Okay, the one thing I would say is that when a PI makes the decision that they want to involve another party in the work that they're doing, there are various risk levels associated with the different subrecipients that they can employ. Obviously, many of us are subbing out to many of us. So other institutions of higher education, you know, they have a certain risk level that we tend to feel more comfortable with. When you go to industry, when you go international, when you go, you know, to other places that maybe aren't known as well, there's more risk there. The biggest risk, of course, being that the sub is not going to be able to fulfill the terms of the award, that they go bankrupt, so that they cannot carry that out. So I think part of the process for a department administrator is working with their PIs during the proposal process to see which subs they plan on using and who they want to use, and you know, educating the PIs that, hey, you know, there's a certain risk level tied to going this route. So we want to be very thoughtful about who we're giving our money to. Generally speaking, though, subrecipient monitoring is managed at a central level. Risk assessments are often done at a central level. Guidance provided as to whether someone is a sub or whether they're a vendor, whether they're a consultant, is coming from a central level. But again, from the department perspective, it's kind of getting ahead of the game and recognizing the risk involved in who you may be dealing with, and then making sure that those expenditures for those subs are hitting those awards as part of their expenditure review process. If you know that you're giving $1 million to Georgia Tech, which would be great, you want to make sure that your award is showing those expenditures from the work that Georgia Tech is doing. So I think that to that extent, that's where the departments can really help out a lot.
All right, and I have one last question before we go to break. How does your institution handle residual balances on awards in instances where the sponsor does not want the funds returned?
Yeah, so that's gonna vary also depending on the various institutions. You have most places that I'm aware of, assuming it's a fixed price contract where you spent X amount of awarded dollars and then you have a certain amount left. The one thing we would always question is it a lot, right? Like if someone gives you an award for $100,000 and you only spent 20 and somehow you're done, the question would be, how is there that big of a difference? Did you overestimate in your proposal process how long or how much something would involve? Are you sure that you actually did everything that the sponsor requested? So that would be the first question that we would ask. And then, typically what would happen is that those funds then get awarded or returned back to the department for them to use, depending on how they wish. Now, how they ultimately distribute it to the PIs, individual PIs, that I'm not sure of. But I think most places are going to allow those funds to be going back to the school or department, hopefully to be used on other research aims or things, that would benefit the research enterprise for that particular lab. But it is important for all of you to have a policy in place for that, but follow that policy, but always question if there's a big residual balance, why is that the case? Because it really should not be the case.
That's good information, Josh. Thanks. That's certainly relevant to my institution as well, as we're looking at a residual balance policy. So I don't see any other hands raised. I don't have any other questions that are coming in the chat. So I just want to thank you, Josh, for your time and your expertise and sharing that with the group. It was a great presentation. If you guys have any other questions, I'm sure Josh's contact information's out there. You can probably Google them and send them an email or something on the slides too. And so those slides, again, they were sent in the chat, but they'll also be sent after the presentation. So thanks again, Josh.
All right, thank you. And I saw in the chat, I'm sorry I couldn't see all my old Emory and Georgia State friends, but it was great to virtually be able to talk to you again and to everybody.
Yeah, they're on there. All right, thank you. So guys, we're going to take looks like a 10-minute break, and we'll be back with our diversity and inclusion session at 2:15. All right, see you then.